Let's talk about medical responses to trans identities. So, as a reminder, what it means to be cis is that one identifies the gender one was assigned at birth. What it means to be trans is that one does not identify with the gender that was assigned at birth. For some trans folks, it's really, really important to be able to access gender affirmation surgeries and hormones and different kinds of medical support services. For some trans folks, this is not particularly important. It's really, really crucial that we recognize that there is a variety of different preferences and different ways of being, right? Being trans is not some sort of monolithic thing. It's not that there's one way to be trans. There are many, many, many different experiences, right? Because shocking, trans folks are people and people are different from one another. Okay, so in the text for today, I want to make sure that I begin by noting that some of the terminology that Dean Spade uses is rather out of date by now. So first of all, Dean Spade uses the term transsexual in this text. Now, this is a pretty dated term. Most people do not use it anymore. If you are outside of the trans community, it is especially not a great term to use. Transsexual refers to somebody who is trans and who wishes, whether they've been able to or not, to be able to access these sorts of medical interventions in order to have their body fit into gendered expectations of the gender that they actually are, right? So folks who wish to access medicalized interventions. The reason we have stopped using this term is because it so intensely focuses on whether or not a person, again, wishes to or has been able to access these sorts of medical interventions. And it sort of reinforces that it's okay to scrutinize a person in terms of what their genitalia looks like right now, which is something that trans folks have historically been subject to, incredibly invasive questions, being like, oh, so like, what is the status of your breasts, right? Like that's a creepy question for strangers to ask. It is creepy and it's invasive and it's alarming to me. So the classification of an identity as being transsexual sort of reinforces this view of what is most important about being trans is one's bodily configuration, which is why we really stopped using this term, right? So now we just use the term transgender or we use the term trans, which is a much broader umbrella term. However, Dean Spade, who is trans, as he talks about in this text, thinks that the term transsexual is really important because it identifies the specific group of people who are seeking to access these medicalized support services, right? So that is why Spade uses the term transsexual in this text. Spade gets to use this. If you're outside of the trans community, I strongly recommend not using that term. Okay. So that is one piece of vocabulary that I want to make sure we're aware of. The other piece of vocabulary that I want to make sure that we are aware of is that in the text, Spade talks about gender identity disorder, right? So GID. This is, once again, outdated. This was a medical diagnosis that classified being trans as a disorder. There's a reason we no longer have this as a diagnosis. It is certainly a sign of progress, that it is, again, no longer in our official medical books that being trans is a disorder. Instead, there is now the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Notice that disorder is not part of this condition. And that refers to someone whose experience within, both their biological and social, both body and role, does not align with, again, like one's actual identity. So now we have gender dysphoria. There is, however, still a great deal of debate about the fact that gender dysphoria is listed in the official Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Psychological Conditions and Disorders, right? There are complicated conversations to be had about whether or not it's reasonable to include gender dysphoria in this official diagnostic book. Now, the reasons against including gender dysphoria in this official book is that it reinforces stigma against trans people. It reinforces this idea that being trans is bad or wrong or something that requires interventions or correcting. It reinforced the idea that maybe actually it is a disorder. And that's, I think, something we need to take very seriously. At the same time, a lot of folks argue that, look, we need to keep gender dysphoria in this manual. We need to keep it as something that can be a diagnosis because it's the only way for trans folks to access health insurance for any of the support services that one might wish to access. We live in a world where all of these medical resources are incredibly expensive. If you don't have a diagnosis, your insurance won't cover it. It would be incredibly shitty to have a setup where only wealthy folks have access to different kinds of medical interventions or medical support services. And let's be real, that's basically the world we currently live in. Wealthy folks have much, much, much greater access to these services already. Folks who are not incredibly wealthy have much longer waiting lists. It is much, much, much more difficult, often because you have to drive hours out of the way to different clinics, which requires taking time off of work. It is much harder to even pay for services, even if insurance will cover it. We don't have equal access to medical support services already, but keeping gender dysphoria in the books is one way to help at least a little bit. This is what Spade is diving into in this text, is the ways in which our medical establishment serves as a gatekeeping mechanism in order to police and monitor and maintain various identities connected to gender. Okay, so let's go through these ideas. Let's actually go way back to a couple lessons ago when we were thinking about the role of social media, and we were thinking specifically about the ways in which, in this case, women are taught to think of their bodies as, like not fitting up to the ideals of femininity, and then are encouraged to go seek plastic surgery. It's really easy for a cis woman to access plastic surgery, like incredibly easy. You can get a nose job easily. If you have money, you can get a boob job. If you have money, you can get basically whatever plastic surgery you want. There's not usually a requirement that you speak to several psychologists and wait 6 months. You don't have to, as Spade discusses, live as a small-nosed person for 6 months before you're able to get that nose job, that rhinoplasty. Right? So it's the case that for a cis woman, for a cis person, it's really easy to access these different kinds of medical interventions. Next, let's think about medical interventions on intersex folks and intersex babies. As we know, when an intersex baby is born, doctors declare a medical emergency and will often either strongly advise and sometimes even require that the baby undergo different kinds of medical interventions to alter their body and their genitalia. So while cis folks can access medical interventions very easily, and while intersex folks are essentially forced into these medical interventions, for trans folks, it's incredibly difficult to access these medical interventions, to access these different kinds of medical services. We have wildly different requirements for each of these three groups, even though in some cases, we're talking about the exact same medical intervention. It is extraordinarily easy for a cis woman to have a breast reduction or to have her breasts entirely removed, maybe because of preventative cancer step, a step to prevent cancer. But it's easy to do. You don't have to, again, live for many months and go through multiple rounds of psychological counseling before you're allowed to even schedule the surgery. Whereas for trans folks, accessing that exact same surgery, trying to get top surgery, it's really difficult. In order to access these medical interventions, as Spade discusses, trans folks are often required to perform a certain kind of narrative. within this narrative, there is this incredibly strong pressure and expectation for what it is that trans folks have to say their childhood and their life experiences and their relationships with gender have been like. Right? So as Spade discusses, there's this expectation that trans folks talk about their childhood as being filled with the certainty that they were assigned the wrong gender at birth. Right? So as a child, I always knew that I was a girl, even though people were treating me as a boy. Or saying, I despised it when people made me play football because it was terrible, because I am not actually a boy, as people were, trying to force me to be. There's this expectation that there's, again, this deep abhorrence for and discomfort with the gendered characteristics or gendered behaviors associated with the gender that was assigned at birth, right? This is some trans people's experiences. It's not everyone's. And this isn't a requirement that is imposed upon cis people when thinking about gender. So let's pause right here for a moment. There are many, many, many little boys who like to take care of their toys and stuffed animals, who are nurturing towards their toys and stuffed animals. There are many, many, many little girls who like to run around and climb trees. If those children are cisgender, we tend not to say, oh, I don't know, sweetheart, you climbed a tree. Are you sure you're actually a girl? Right? We allow for a much more expansive and flexible relationship with one's gender if one is cis. Right? We don't impose this kind of intense scrutiny on cis children or adults. And we don't impose this requirement of being so narrowly within this gendered role and this gendered expectation. But we do impose that upon trans folks in order to receive the medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. There's some variation here, but overwhelmingly, in order to receive that medical diagnosis, the psychologist has to sign off on it, and they need to hear the narrative that they have been taught to expect to hear, which includes saying, people thought that I was a boy, but I hated all of the boy things, which includes saying, every time somebody calls me sir, it just, it's a terrible, awful experience, which includes saying, no, obviously, I just want to live my life always and only coded and treated as a woman. There can't be any ambiguity. There can't be any fluidity or flexibility there. So there's this expectation that trans folks be in this really, really narrow role of either idealized femininity or idealized masculinity with no complexity. And we don't impose that same expectation on cis folks. Cis folks are expected to live up to the idealized conceptions of masculinity or femininity. But if somebody is failing to live up to, again, those expectations of femininity, we don't say, well, are you really sure that you're actually a woman? Right? And so we say, oh, well, try harder, or we'll socially censure you. So these different sorts of treatments and expectations serve a particular kind of function. They serve as a way to keep people within these binary sex and gender categories. So for cis folks, having this great amount of flexibility serves as a way to say, okay, you can be a girl that is, somewhat ambivalent about some of the norms of femininity, but you still get to count as a girl. And that keeps people within that binary gender category of being a girl or a woman, as being the gender and sex one was assigned at birth. So it keeps cis people within these two binary categories. Similarly, the heightened scrutiny and set of expectations imposed upon trans folks means that as trans folks are saying, no, I was slotted into the wrong category when I was born, like this is not my identity. First of all, it's really, really hard to get actual validation and support for no longer being treated as inhabiting the gender category assigned at birth. So all of these, again, gatekeeping mechanisms serve as a way to keep trans folks within that binary gender category assigned at birth. And then after performing this extraordinarily narrow conception of either masculinity or femininity will finally get recognition and say, okay, I guess you were in the wrong category. You can go over into, again, category of the gender one actually has, so long as you, again, have this extremely narrow, rigid performance of and understanding of your own gender, right? So it reinforces that there are these two categories. I sometimes think of it as like magnets. There's this magnet of womanhood and manhood. And the ways that the magnets work is that they're trying to keep people on one of these, within one of these two boxes, within these two poles. Once you escape the pull of one magnet, you're forced over really strongly into the other one. I don't know if that analogy actually works, right? Okay, so we can see the ways in which these binary, cis normative expectations function to reinforce the binary categories of sex and gender. So just as we started to see the ways in which, oh, actually gender already permeates our sex categories, we can start to see the ways in which cis normativity also permeates these binary categories. It's not just that we have two categories that we're trying to keep everyone in. We're also trying to, again, reinforce the idea that the, giant scare quotes, natural thing is for folks to, in fact, be the gender they were assigned at birth. And that any movement away from the gender assigned at birth, again, it's a really high bar to clear. Any movement away is, first of all, dissuaded, inhibited, and then only supported in incredibly narrow terms. Concerning in and of itself. It's especially concerning given that this just doesn't track the reality of how a lot of people, again, engage with or interact with gender. Just as many cis people enjoy characteristics that are associated with gender other than their own, many trans folks have and enjoy and appreciate characteristics of a gender other than one that they in fact have, right? One can be a woman, whether they are cis or trans, and also enjoy football and not be any less of a woman. One can have complicated relationships with, what it is to be treated as a man or a woman, right? One can find it weird when somebody says, oh, how you doing, ma'am? Even if you are a woman, that can be a weird experience sometimes. Maybe you just prefer it, having gender be so front and center all of the time. As Spade discusses, and he also interviews so many folks over the course of this article, there's just a great deal of variety in terms of people's lived experiences and relationships with gender. And it just isn't the case that all trans folks have this one monolithic experience. Crucially, it also isn't the case that everyone always perfectly and completely fits within one of two binary gender categories, always and for all time, right? Instead, many folks experience some kind of, either gender ambiguity or gender fluidity, right? So one might find that, yeah, in this context, I am a woman. In another context, I really am a man. Or one might find that one's gender and other aspects of identity might shift and change over the course of one's lifetime. It doesn't always have to be static for the entirety of your life. It might be something that you figure out as you go forward. It might be something that, oh no, you were actually right in saying I was a woman as a teen, or I guess a young woman as a teenager. And then you might be right in saying, you know what, really non-binary now in my 40s. And you also might be right in saying, you know what, my identity has changed once again now that I'm in my 60s, right? It can be the case that identity isn't always static. We allow for growth and change in so many other aspects of our identities, but not in terms of gender, and as we'll talk about, not in terms of sexual orientation. And it's worth thinking about why we have such odd double standards and whether that serves to support or inhibit people's identities and their flourishing in their lives.